I'm an ugly American, and welcome to TV Trash! Yeah, we are definitely crossing the streams on this one. This is already looking to be the most chaotic baseball season in years. And we're not even talking about the slew of new rules changes intent on speeding up the pace of the game, which have polarized the fans to say the least. No, we're talking about how at some point this season, a number of teams may no longer have a place to air games on television. For those not aware, for many years now, most Major League Baseball teams were televising games on what became known as regional sports networks, or RSNs. Networks that covered one area of the country specifically while still being owned by a huge conglomerate. Fox was the largest carrier of these networks for years, until they were included in the sale of Fox to Disney. Though Murdoch kept ownership of the national Fox Sports networks. Because Disney already owned ESPN and its affiliates, they were forced by law to divest themselves of the Fox RSNs, and that pushed them to sell them off to Sinclair Media for about half of what they had hoped to get for them. And yet, even though Sinclair only paid $10 billion for them, they soon ran them so far into the ground they had no hope of making anything off of them, as their combined greed and desire to stick it to streaming platforms caused what were now known as the Bally Sports RSNs to be off every cable, satellite, and streaming service except for AT&T and DirecTV. Surprise, surprise! Sinclair lost so much money over the networks that the subsidiary that runs them, Diamond Sports, is declaring bankruptcy and already stated they won't be making a number of rights fees payments that they owe a certain number of MLB clubs. Which is gonna be a problem, especially to any clubs that increased payroll over the offseason. And they're not the only ones. AT&T Sportsnet has also admitted they will be defaulting on payments to MLB clubs, with the parent company pretty much saying they want out of the RSN business. Suffice it to say, the future of regional sports networks looks grim. So much so that Major League Baseball itself has come out and said it is developing contingency plans should the RSNs go under. Pretty much saying they'll take over the broadcasts themselves. And anyone who remembers what happened the last time baseball tried something like that has got to be shaking in their shoes. What do we mean by that? Well, it's time to rip off Jaguar Gator as we delve into the disaster that was the Baseball Network. Now, before we go into all the details of why Major League Baseball's first attempt to run its own broadcasting show was a complete debacle, we need some context into the history of baseball and it being televised nationwide. For many years through the 1980s, baseball's national broadcast coverage was split between ABC and NBC, to the point where you would catch the World Series on one of those two networks one season, and then the next year it would be on the other network. That seems like it would be confusing to deal with back then, but when you remember that you only had about 3 or 4 stations back in those days, at least you didn't have to do a lot of channel flipping. But by the late 1980s, the third network in the room seemed to step in and say they wanted a piece of the pie too. And by a piece, they meant the whole pie. CBS, in a desperate attempt to get out of being in last place in the network ratings, threw more than $1.5 billion at Major League Baseball for the exclusive rights to nationally televised games, including the playoffs and World Series, beginning in 1990. On the surface, this didn't seem like as much of an issue as it might be today. Back then, the MLB playoffs only included the American League Championship Series, the National League Championship Series, and the World Series. So there would never be a day when more than 2 games were playing. When that happened, you just had one afternoon game and one night game and everything was taken care of. The problem turned into just how little priority CBS gave the sport during the regular season. They regularly aired games featuring teams in major markets rather than who was in the current pennant races. And yes, back in those days, the two weren't overlapping. In the early 1990s, the New York Yankees were actually a pretty bad team, while the Toronto Blue Jays were among the best teams in baseball, winning the World Series twice. People in CBS's main office began grumbling about their obligated coverage of the playoffs, making them miss out on events like the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings. They began preempting the pregame shows for regular primetime shows. Local affiliates not in MLB markets began preempting the regular Saturday game of the week for paid programming. And by the fourth and final year of the deal in 1993, CBS itself was regularly preempting Saturday baseball for the likes of golf and college football. At the end of it all, CBS had lost around $500 million on the baseball deal. And what made it worse was making the deal likely cost them their long-standing relationship with the NBA, who migrated to NBC just as some guy named Michael Jordan was about to take that sport into new heights. Oops. And so, in May of 1993, just 1 month into the last year with CBS, Major League Baseball announced a new joint partnership where the leagues themselves would be the actual producers of the television content and outsource the distribution to NBC and ABC. It was a pretty strange deal put together in order to entice those two TV networks to come back. As in exchange for contributing $10 million each for the startup costs, ABC and NBC would get 50% of advertising revenue after the first $140 million generated, but only up to the next $30 million after that. The leagues would get 85% of the first $140 million, and then 80% of all money generated after the first $170 million. ABC would begin broadcasting regular season games on July 16, 1994, and would have 6 broadcast dates on Monday or Saturday nights, before NBC would pick things up for Friday night broadcasts for the rest of the season. So, just what could possibly go wrong? Everything. Just about everything. Let's start with that little detail that the Baseball Network's coverage of regular season games started on July 16th. Many of you are probably aware that the baseball season begins in April. The Baseball Network's very first official broadcast was the 1994 Major League All-Star Game on July 12th. Which meant there was no coverage of baseball through mainstream broadcast television for the entire first half of the season. It probably had nothing to do with the fact that NBC spent most of those first 3 months focusing entirely on the NBA playoffs, while ABC had the NHL playoffs, the latter of which ABC lost to Fox after the 1994 season anyway. Then there was the little detail that the Baseball Network claimed total sovereignty over the time slots it was airing, banning the individual teams from carrying their own team broadcasts in those same slots. That meant if your team was playing at the time of a Baseball Night in America telecast, be it Saturday or Monday nights for ABC or Friday nights on NBC, and your team's game wasn't in the rotation for that night, hey, I hope you still enjoy radio! All that might have been bad enough had the Baseball Network been allowed to fully operate in 1994. But then, something happened. On August 12, 1994, the Major League Baseball players unilaterally went on strike as negotiations between them and the team owners over a new collective bargaining agreement hit a standstill over the players' refusal to accept, among other things, a mandatory cap on what each team could spend on player salaries. A limit the owners were claiming was necessary to prevent teams in larger markets from dominating the game and smaller teams from going bankrupt. This was despite the fact that the 6 MLB clubs in the top 3 markets of New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago had combined for a grand total of 2 World Series titles since 1992, and the game seeing record attendances and revenues as well. It should be noted that despite those record attendance numbers, the Baseball Network was originally slated to generate about 50% less advertising revenue than what was made with the CBS deal. Funny how no one seems to suggest there may have been a correlation in the leagues taking a huge cut in revenues with their own self-owned network, just as they were in negotiations with the union for a new labor deal. I mean, it's not like baseball had a history of colluding against the players before. There had been work stoppages before in baseball, but this one was absolutely the most devastating. The two sides failed to come to any agreement in time to salvage the remainder of the season, and it forced the cancellation of the World Series for only the second time in history, the last time being all the way back in 1903. ABC lost most of its scheduled broadcast dates for the 1994 season, and NBC lost all of theirs, as they weren't slated to begin broadcasts until August 26th. The impasse continued throughout the entire off-season to the point where the teams opened spring training in 1995 with replacement players, and were on the verge of starting the season with those replacements until at the last moment the two sides agreed for the striking players to return to playing while a new agreement was still being negotiated. The backlash from the fans was massive. Clubs played to half-empty ballparks on even opening day, the one day usually guaranteed to sell out for most teams. Boos rang down on even hometown players for much of the season, as working and even middle-class individuals just had no sympathy for those who had taken the game away from them over the issue of getting paid millions of dollars to play a sport. All of this was just poison for everyone involved in baseball for the majority of the 1995 season, and the Baseball Network was no exception. It was so bad that on June 22nd, 1995, NBC and ABC already agreed to dissolve their partnership with MLB following the conclusion of the season, largely because there was no guarantee there wouldn't be another work stoppage. This was before the Baseball Network had even begun broadcasting games for 1995, so that entire season was lame duck for the network altogether. The only real chance Major League Baseball now had to use the Baseball Network to save itself was the 1995 postseason. Because of the strike last year, 1995 was the first time MLB used its revised playoff format with 3 division winners and 1 wildcard team for each league, leading to the creation of the new opening round division series. Instead, the 1995 playoffs turned out to be the ultimate exhibit of just how much of a train wreck the Baseball Network really was. Consider, the division series format meant that up to 4 postseason games could be played on the same day, and MLB and the Baseball Network decided that all those games would be played at the exact same time at around 8 p.m. Eastern Time, with the viewers only getting to watch one game determined entirely on regionalization. Yes, even though there were 2 networks with the rights to carry the games, only one would carry all the playoff games on one particular night, all at the same time. Remember, this was nearly 25 years before live streaming was a thing, and one network could have possibly shown multiple games via multiple outlets, if they would have even agreed to do that anyway. which means there were multiple nights for the first week of the baseball playoffs where you were denied any chance to watch up to 75% of the games played on that day. The ridiculousness continued into the League Championship Series, where 2 games would play at the exact same time on at most 4 of the 10 potential game days. That would have meant one possible day when a Game 6 of one series and Game 7 of the other were playing at the same time. The 2 series could have been clinched on the same night, and you would have only been allowed to watch one of them. Even when it finally reached the World Series, the lunacy didn't stop. Because the strike had killed last year's series and one network's ability to carry it, the compensation was ABC and NBC both carrying the 1995 series for alternating games. One game would air on ABC, and then the next would go to NBC. In case you're wondering, the 2 networks were about as willing to co-promote with one another as WWE and WCW would have been. Here's how Al Michaels handled a promo during Game 1 of the World Series for the upcoming games.
What about the World Series tomorrow? Well, it's on television. We can't tell you where, but here's a hint. Our good pals Costas, Euchre, and Morgan were spotted in underground Atlanta.
By the way, who would air Game 7 of the World Series? We didn't know! As the Atlanta Braves and Cleveland Indians took the field for Game 6, it still wasn't announced which network would carry a possible Game 7 that would have been played on the very next night. Thankfully, we didn't have to see Bob Costas and Brent Musburger fight in Thunderdome for that game's rights, as the Braves won Game 6 to clinch their first World Series in at least their history of playing in Atlanta. And with that, the baseball network came to an end in one of the biggest whimpers in sports history. Following negotiations that briefly suggested CBS might be coming back to baseball, MLB ultimately entered a new agreement with Fox, who had poached NFL telecasts from CBS 2 years earlier. The Fox network began broadcasting regular season and playoff games, including the World Series, in 1996. No one network has had sole possession of the baseball playoff coverage since, though after alternating with NBC for the rest of the 20th century, Fox has been the exclusive home of the World Series since 2001. So yeah, the performance of the baseball network did about as well as Alex Rodriguez did in his final at-bat of the 2010 season. You guys know I gotta bring that thing up again! All in all, the baseball network lost about $500 million total, generating only around $5.5 million in revenue for each major league club, compared to the $14.7 million per team the CBS deal had generated. Obviously, some problems were not completely the part of the network itself, as the players' strike very likely would have damaged the viewership no matter who was carrying the games. But it was clear those running the baseball network made many of the same mistakes that had happened during the CBS years. To force all games being played on one day into the same time slot, and then often determine what games markets without a club would get based on the larger market clubs rather than who was in the race, was just an infuriatingly bad decision and a terrible waste of being able to use the broadcast to promote players over teams, as the former had worked for other sports leagues for years. One can only hope the mistakes baseball and its TV partners made in the 1990s won't ever be repeated, but you can't blame people for being skeptical. At the time of this video's production, no one really knows the future of baseball broadcasts and the regional sports networks responsible for most of them. It's possible something even more breaking will be announced by the time this video is posted. At the very least, the internet streaming might give them the ability to do it better this time, as Major League Baseball and the clubs will have far more options to broadcast their events, and the fans and viewers can only hope those in charge can ultimately use those options to give them the best experience possible. But it's very likely it will all be wasted by the two things that keep getting in the way: greed and stupidity. So yeah, basically, baseball keeps getting stabbed in the back by the same idiocy that has plagued television for years. Who knew? Pretty much everyone with a brain.